Fact be totally imperceptible for someone else with another paradigm. Now that's a wild statement, I know. When I first read Kuhn's book, I was stunned by the implications. But since 1973, I have seen repeatedly that what Kuhn describes for scientists is true for all of us who have rules and regulations in our lives. And who doesn't? Whether it's the Army or IBM, whether it's the police or the Isaac Walton League, whether it's the coach's way to hit the serve or mom's way to clean the kitchen, we deal with paradigms all the time. And I believe it is our rules and regulations that keep us from successfully anticipating the future, because we try to discover the future by looking at it through our old paradigms. And so, in the 1960s, we looked forward and concluded cheap gasoline forever. 4 children make an ideal family. Long hair belongs on women. Women belong in the home. And boy, were we wrong. And we were wrong because of the power of our paradigms to influence us and keep us from seeing what was really happening. Now, this is all an interesting abstraction. And so what I'd like now to do is to give you 6 concrete examples that will illustrate how paradigms influence the way we see and understand the world. Let's start with an example similar to one Thomas Kuhn cites in his book. We'll use elements you know quite well, cards from a card deck. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 9 cards very rapidly. I want you to identify them silently to yourself as I go through them. I'll give you a couple of seconds between each card. Ready? Here we go. Good. Now let's go through it a second time in case you missed some. This time I'm going to give you twice as much time as before. All right. Let's go through it one more time for a final check. This time I'm going to give you 4 times as much time as I gave you before. Okay, that's enough. How many of you noticed something strange about these cards? For instance, how many of you noticed that the 3rd card was a red 6 of spades? Or that this card was a black 8 of hearts? Or that the last card was a red 9 of spades? I know that most of you missed these exceptions on the first run-through. And I know some of you missed it on the second run-through, too. Yet I'll also bet that almost all of you were able to identify the legitimate cards when they came up. Now, if you missed the exceptions, don't feel bad. A lot of people do. If you wonder why you missed those exceptional cards, I'll explain. You see, it was your card deck paradigm that was blocking your vision of the exceptional cards. Remember what I said about paradigms and how they filter information? Well, you were working very hard to see the cards the right way. Right means according to your card deck paradigm. Black spades, black clubs, red hearts, red diamonds. And so you saw the legitimate cards very easily, very quickly. In fact, I'll bet some of you saw them on the very first run-through, and that was quicker than 1/30th of a second. But your card deck paradigm also kept you from seeing those cards that broke the rules. So instead of seeing them as they were, you distorted the information to make them fit your paradigm. That's the power of paradigms in action. Now, this is a funny deck of cards. And it's easy to write off this entire experience as interesting but irrelevant to real life. So let's talk about paradigms and real life. For instance, millions of Americans are now into the fitness paradigm. They have whole new rules about exercise. But how many of you would be willing to go for a 70-mile run? Yes, I said run. Now, in our culture, the words 70 miles and run just don't go together. 70 miles and drive, yes. Run, no. But in northern Mexico, 70-mile runs are common among the Tarahumara Indians. They do it as part of a religious festival. Now, why is it so easy for them, yet so impossible for us? Because it's part of the Tarahumaran paradigm. So they do it for fun. Would you believe that our culture's ultimate competition, the 26-mile marathon, is child's play for the Tarahumarans? Now, you might argue that it's some kind of genetic difference, but I am willing to bet that if any one of you had been raised in one of their villages, you'd run just like they do, because you would have learned their running paradigm. I've brought you to this vocational technical center in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, to show you another paradigm. This one has to do with automobiles. In 1976, a group of students in the advanced class taught by Ernie Parker decided to build an energy-efficient car. Let me give you the numbers on the car. It weighed 2,000 pounds. It went 0 to 60 in less than 10 seconds. It got 77 miles per gallon on a 16-horsepower engine. Now, anybody who knows anything about cars knows that that's impossible. You can't take that heavy a car to those speeds with only a 16-horsepower engine. And yet, these students did exactly that. How? By using a different paradigm. You see, these students weren't in the advanced auto mechanics class. They were right here in the advanced fluid power technology class. And they knew, using their paradigm, that they could capture and reuse energy ordinary cars waste. Let me show you how. It's actually a very simple design. When this car slows down, it doesn't use standard brakes, which just create heat and friction. Instead, the back wheels turn a hydraulic pump, and it pumps hydraulic fluid into this storage chamber and builds up pressure. Now, building up that pressure is resistance, and that slows the car down. When this car is at a stop sign, it doesn't idle its engine. Instead, it runs the engine 80% open throttle, and that engine turns a hydraulic pump, which pumps more fluid and pressure into that storage chamber. Result: when this car begins to accelerate after the stoplight has changed, the acceleration comes not from the little engine, but all that energy that's been stored in that cylinder. In fact, let me demonstrate. I can accelerate without even starting the engine. So, the little gasoline engine merely holds the car at speed, and it can do that getting more than 70 miles per gallon. That's pretty clever. Now, the paradigm question is this. If the students who designed this car had been in auto mechanics, do you think they could have even conceived it? I think the answer is no, because the auto mechanics paradigm does not provide for energy storage. Now, I'm not suggesting this car is perfect. It has lots of bugs, but it does demonstrate how powerful paradigms can be. What may be impossible with one paradigm may be easy to do with another paradigm. Let me show you another paradigm change in technology. This one is small but interesting, especially to me. What is this? Look at it this way. Look at it this way. Look at it this way. Yes, it's a bicycle seat. And obviously, it breaks the bicycle seat paradigm. It was invented by a sculptor and a futurist. I was a futurist. Jeffrey Birch was a sculptor. I came up with the idea, and together we developed it. We call it the Easy Seat. Now, it's no big deal. It's not going to save the world or anything like that, though it does save some pain in some particularly sensitive areas. But when you look at it, it makes a kind of sense, doesn't it? Yet, since the invention of the bicycle, another shape has totally dominated the market. It looks like this. It's called the bicycle saddle. And I believe it's the word saddle that has kept bike makers from exploring shapes like the Easy Seat. You see, this is a logical redesign of a horse saddle for a bicycle. And once they got the saddle paradigm, the bike makers improved it and refined it and forgot to ask the basic question: what's the most comfortable way to sit on a bicycle? And that's where I had an advantage. I wasn't part of the bicycle industry. I didn't know any better. I wasn't saddled with their paradigm. And so I invented an unusual looking but comfortable bike seat. By the way, you can imagine what professional bikers think of the Easy Seat. It doesn't fit the rules, so they don't like it, yet. There's a story told in corporate circles that's worth repeating here. In the late 1930s, a man went to visit the research department of a major photography company. He had come to show them a new kind of photography that was his invention. With him, he brought a bag filled with the equipment he needed to actually show how it worked. While the senior researcher looked on, he pulled out a shiny steel mirror, a piece of fur, a rod made of amber, a piece of paper with an image on it, and a bottle of fine black powder. He started by rubbing the amber rod with the fur. Then he touched the rod to the mirror. Then he laid the paper face down on the mirror and exposed both to a very bright light. Then he peeled back the paper, shook the fine black powder on the mirror, and then blew it away. What was left on that mirror was a faint reminder of the image that had been on the paper. He had created a kind of photograph of that image. Now, we don't know exactly what that senior researcher said. He may have complained about the black powder on his desk. He may have laughed a little bit. But we do know one thing for sure. He showed that inventor to the door. He wasn't interested in his silly invention. But you know, the inventor, Chester Carlson, had the last laugh, because his invention has become one of the most profitable innovations in the history of industry. You see, what Chester Carlson had invented was the Xerox process, electrostatic photography. But for that senior researcher, it just didn't fit his paradigm. And so he couldn't see its enormous potential and thus missed one of the great business opportunities of the 20th century. For my final example of the power and influence of paradigms, I'd like you to come with me to a lecture I'm going to give to a group of corporate managers. I'm going to show you 3 words, all right? And I'm going to ask you to think back to the early 60s and ask yourself, what kinds of judgmental statements, judgmental feelings would I have had about these 3 words back in the early 60s? The 3 words are made in Japan. Okay, now in 1960, what are the words that would have come to mind when you saw those products, please?
Junk.
Junk, all right. What else?
Cheap.
Cheap, okay, what else?
Poor quality.
Poor quality, that's a good one. Poor quality. What else?
Copies.
Copies. So they're stealing again. What else?
Low tech.
All right. Okay. Good. Toys. Low tech. Toys. Anything else come to mind?
Imitation.
Imitation. Okay, that's enough. Now, let's ask about today. What kinds of judgmental words come to mind when you run into these three words? Made in Japan.
Excellent quality.
Excellent quality. Okay, what else?
High tech.
High tech. Aha, that's good. What else?
Expensive.
Expensive. Went from cheap to expensive, huh? Okay, another one.
Leadership.
Okay, another one.
Balance of payments.
Another one.
Innovation.
Innovation. What a nice compliment. Anything else? All right. Actually, that's enough when you look at it. What's most interesting about this is, do you notice the contrasts? In many cases, you have given me opposites. What they were doing in the early 60s, they have totally reversed in the 80s. And the key point here is this. What this represents, I believe, is a change of paradigms. What they did, and they actually started in the 50s when Ed Deming, an American, went to Japan, is they adopted a new series of rules and regulations, what we call zero-defect production, or now we're calling it Japanese management or participatory management. And what they did is they got people involved in perfecting things. See, I believe the Japanese have created an epidemic of quality worldwide. And it's a disease which, if you don't get it, you may not survive. People tell me, paradigms, that's a cute idea, but who really cares? Tell me about it. I could go on and on with examples. I have more than 150 in my files. The key point is this. Paradigms dramatically influence our judgments and our decision-making by influencing our perceptions. And it's clear to me that if you want to be able to make good judgments about the future and anticipate the future successfully, you must understand your own present paradigms and how they influence you, and then be able to look beyond them. You see, a paradigm is a two-edged sword. When you swing it one way, it cuts the information that agrees with it into very fine, precise detail. But when you swing it the other way, it will cut you away from information that runs counter to the paradigm. You see best what you're supposed to see, just like the card deck. And you tend to see poorly, or not at all, that information that doesn't fit the paradigm. Now, let me share with you 6 key observations about paradigms and their influence on us. Point number 1, paradigms are common. We have rules in many aspects of our life, whether it's professional or personal or spiritual or social. Point number 2, paradigms are useful. Now, it may have sounded like I don't like paradigms, but that's not the case at all. In fact, paradigms tell us what we should spend our time on, what's important to us and what's not. They help us solve problems by defining those problems that are important to solve. They focus our attention, and that's good. But, and point number 3 is a warning. Sometimes your paradigm can become the paradigm, the only way to do something. And when you're confronted with an alternative idea, you reject it out of hand. That can lead to a nasty disorder. And I call that disorder paradigm paralysis. Paradigm paralysis is a terminal disease of certainty. It's easy to catch, and it's very dangerous. And more than a few institutions have been destroyed because they caught it. This makes me think of a phrase that captures what I've just talked about pretty well. Those who don't believe something can be done should get out of the way of those who are doing it. Point number 4. The people who create new paradigms tend to be outsiders. Now, they can be young, they can be older. Age seems to be actually irrelevant. The key point here is they are not part of the established paradigm community. They are not invested in the old paradigm. And since they are not invested in the old, they lose nothing by creating the new. This means something very special for you. If you want to look to the new paradigms developing in your field, you must look beyond the center to the fringes. because almost always the new rules are written at the edge. That's where Xerox started. That's where Apple computers were developed. That's where Christianity began. That's where the women's movement began. All of them at the edge. Point number 5. Those practitioners of the old paradigm who choose to join with the new paradigm early in its development have to be very courageous. Because you see, there isn't enough evidence to prove they should do that. Now, let me quote from Thomas Kuhn himself, because he says it best in his book. He writes, "The person who embraces a new paradigm at an early stage must often do so in defiance of the evidence provided by the problem solving. He must, that is, have faith that the new paradigm will succeed with the many large problems that confront it, knowing only that the older paradigm has failed with a few. A decision of that kind can only be made on faith." These pioneers take great professional risk when they make this change to the new paradigm, because if that paradigm ends up a dead end, and sometimes that does happen, they've lost all their credibility with the practitioners of the old paradigm. Point number 6. This is the last and the most important. You can choose to change your paradigm. Human beings are not genetically encoded with just one way of doing things. You can choose to shrug off one set of rules and adopt another set. You can choose to see the world anew. That's why I'm such an optimist about the future. Now, let me tell you a story. There was a young man who had a very fast car and loved to drive high in the mountains of California, where the highways were only 2 lanes wide and there were dangerous blind curves. But he was a great driver, so he could handle these things. One Saturday, he was out driving his favorite road, coming up to his favorite blind curve, when around that curve came a car careening, almost out of control. He went this way and that way and this way and that way, and just before it got to his car, it pulled back in its lane and went past. As it did so, a beautiful woman stuck her head out of the car window and yelled at him at the top of her lungs. "Pig!" she yelled. Well, he responded in a flash, and he yelled back at her, "Sow!" Thought to himself, how dare she call me a name like that? I was in my lane. She was the one who was all over the place. And feeling rather smug that he got her before she got away, he put the accelerator to the floor, whipped around the blind curve, and ran into the pig. Now, that's a paradigm story. See, the young man had responded with an old set of rules. She called me a name, I'll call her a name. But in fact, she was trying to warn him. I believe the next 10 years are going to be filled with people coming around blind curves and yelling things at you. I believe that if you have paradigm flexibility, what they will be yelling will be opportunities. But I also believe if you have paradigm paralysis, what they will be yelling at you is threats. The choice will be entirely yours. We've been talking about the anticipation of the future. So you may wonder what we're doing in front of this house from the late 19th century. I've chosen to conclude my remarks here because sometimes people get overwhelmed by the future. They look forward and they say, how can we cope with all of this change? The answer to that question, I think, can be found by looking back to our great-grandparents. In many ways, they dealt with changes at least as profound as what we're involved in right now. You must remember, in 1890, radio would have still been considered magic. I mean, inaudible voices traveling through the air without wires. The radio wasn't demonstrated until 1901. Between 1890 and 1910, Henry Ford built his first automobile. The movie camera was invented. The Wright brothers proved the experts wrong and created a new paradigm of heavier-than-air flight. X-rays were discovered. Electric lights had only begun to replace kerosene lamps and gas illumination. The electron was discovered. The cause of malaria was identified. And a man named Albert Einstein proved that E equals mc squared, and the atomic age was conceived. The paradigms of our grandparents were forever altered during this time. And you know what? In spite of all that change, they did just fine. We wouldn't be here if they hadn't. So, even though the future sometimes seems too large, too awesome, too powerful to deal with, it's not. We as human beings have demonstrated repeatedly the capacity to create and deal with paradigm changes. You see, there will always be another solution to the problem. There will always be another door to go through to get to the future. And just like it was for our grandparents, I am positive that on the other side of that door lies more than enough opportunity to keep those of us who are willing to be flexible happy and busy for a lifetime.